Good evening, fellow traveler. Tonight we put aside the weighty matters of philosophy, the drama of dynasties and the clamor of royal courts. For once we won't ponder the fate of empires or the metaphysics of time. Instead, we are going somewhere, much greasier. Yes, tonight's tale is not about kings or crusades, but about crumbs, about little morsels of joy, improvised recipes and culinary decisions made without a shred of food safety regulation. We're talking about medieval junk food. You might think of the Middle Ages as a place of hardship, war, and let's be honest, questionable hygiene. But beneath the layers of wool and centuries of plague, there was something else, an undeniable human urge to snack, to eat something unnecessary but comforting, something warm, maybe a bit sweet, definitely a bit greasy. Something to make a hard day of hauling firewood or avoiding feudal taxes just a little bit better. And so, dear listener, dim the lights. Tuck yourself into the soft folds of your blanket like a noble, wrapping themselves in a tapestry. Turn on a fan or perhaps imagine the soft crackle of a wood fire in a distant hearth. Let's go back in time, not to the battlefields, not to the palaces, but to the market stalls, the dusty fairgrounds, and the smoke-filled kitchens where medieval snacks were born. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow cobblestone street in a 14th century town. The air smells faintly of wet earth, boiled cabbage, and roasted meat. There's a dog barking somewhere, probably chasing a goose. A church bell tolls in the distance, marking the hour with all the solemnity of someone very proud to own a bell. And there it is, near the corner where the apothecary sells mystery powders and the blacksmith hurls curses at his anvil, a small, wooden cart with a puff of smoke rising from it. A hunched woman with soot on her cheeks and arms like iron ladles is turning something in a sizzling pan of pig fat. Congratulations, you found the fritter lady. Medieval street food didn't have branding or hashtags or clever slogans, but it had smells. Rich, smoky, and slightly alarming. It also had queues, peasants, children, tradesmen, all waiting for their turn at a small miracle, the apple fritter. Now, these weren't apples like the ones you see today, neatly waxed and color-coded in a supermarket. No, these were knobbly. Little things, tart, bruised, and possibly stolen from the monastery garden. They were chopped with a knife that hadn't seen a whetstone in years, and tossed into a lumpy batter made from flour, eggs, and, if the cook was feeling fancy, a splash of ale. Water, after all, was unpredictable. Ale, at least, had standards. Then came the fry. And oh, what a spectacle it was. Frying in the 1300s was less of a cooking method and more of an act of theatrical bravery. The oil, usually reused pig fat, hissed and spat like it had opinions. It wasn't just hot, it was judgmental. But if you got it right, out came something golden and glistening, the fritter, crispy on the edges, soft in the middle, and just dangerous enough to keep things interesting. Was it safe? Not entirely. Was it delicious? Absolutely. And if you had coin, or perhaps a friend who worked in the spice trade, it might even come with a dusting of sugar. Not the fine, over-refined kind, but crystalline clumps that crunched between your teeth and screamed status symbol. In a world where most people's diet could best be described as root-based despair. Still, for most, a simple drizzle of honey or a ladle of spiced syrup was more than enough. These fritters didn't need much help. They were warm, indulgent, and, in the words of a monk from Yorkshire, a reason to not lose all hope. So, what did these humble fritters mean to the people of the time? They were joy on a market day, a celebration after Mass, a treat that turned a bad week into a tolerable one. Children begged for them, lovers shared them, even pigeons plotted to steal them. And when one was particularly well cooked, golden, light, and just sweet enough, it made the world for one beautiful moment feel less like a survival simulator and more like a very slow-moving festival. But it wasn't just about the taste. These snacks were cultural, they were economic, they were emotional. They were how people treated themselves in a world where luxury was rare and hard-won. You didn't eat a fritter because you needed it. You ate it because you deserved it, or at least convinced yourself you did. Even the act of buying one, was ritualistic. You'd stand there counting your coppers, weighing the risk of heartburn against the promise of brief culinary ecstasy. And when you finally bit into it, all hot and slightly molten in the middle, you didn't just taste apple. You tasted rebellion. You tasted escape. Now, as we drift further into this evening together, remember this. The story of medieval snacks is not just about food, it's about people, their desires, their small triumphs, their stolen joys. These weren't dishes meant for kings, but for everyone else, the forgotten, the busy, the weary. And in these crispy little indulgences, they found something profoundly human, comfort. So tonight we start our journey not with fanfare but with frying oil, with batter and bruised apples, with laughter in the alleyway and the hum of hungry anticipation, and in the quiet stillness of your room, as your breathing slows and the world fades around you, let the memory of a medieval fritter, imperfect, greasy, wonderful, carry you gently towards sleep. Tomorrow we'll meet the cheese curds, but for now at rest. Let's stay a while longer in that cobbled marketplace, shall we? The fritters are gone now. Nothing left but a smear of grease on your fingers and a suspiciously content pigeon nearby. But as you wander past stalls of wilted greens and suspicious sausages, you spot another offering. It's not flashy, it doesn't steam or sparkle or shout. In fact, it looks a little modest. A small basket sits on the table. Inside are irregular lumps of pale, slightly glossy substance. They're not quite soft, not quite firm. Some are dry, some look like they were just born. And when you lean in close, they give off a faint, oddly comforting tang. These, dear traveler, are cheese curds. Now, don't expect a wheel of golden Gouda or a wedge of artisanal Brie. This isn't cheese for royalty or poets. This is cheese for real life. Cheese that's still figuring out who it wants to be. Cheese that shows up early and makes itself useful. In the Middle Ages, these curds were everywhere, and nowhere at all. They were what happened before cheese happened. See, medieval cheese wasn't trying to be a celebrity. It wasn't drizzled with truffle oil or served on oak planks in candlelight. No, it was made quickly, eaten faster, and expected to survive journeys over hills, rivers, and through the occasional stampede of goats. Cheese had to be practical. And cheese curds, those little early clumps of dairy joy, were as practical as it got. The process was simple in the way that medieval simplicity often involved something a little disturbing. You took milk, preferably not spoiled, added something to make it curdle, often rennet, an enzyme found in the stomach lining of a baby animal, stirred patiently, and waited for magic, or chemistry, or divine dairy intervention. Soon the milk separated into two things, whey, the clear liquid, and curds, the glorious jiggly beginnings of cheese. The curds were then lightly pressed, perhaps salted, and eaten just like that. No aging, no cave, no wrapping in wax. Just fresh, bouncy, irregular globs of squeaky sustenance, and oh, they squeaked. That gentle squeak against your teeth was how you knew they were fresh. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't seductive, but it was deeply satisfying. The edible version of a friend clapping you on the back and saying, "You're doing all right." Monks loved them, travelers packed them. Kids munched on them like candy, assuming the cows had behaved and the curds weren't accidentally dropped in hay. You could eat them plain, fry them in leftover fat, of course, or crumble them over a bowl of something brown and bubbling. They didn't need a celebration or a saint's feast to be brought out. Cheese curds were for ordinary days, which, let's be honest, was most days. They were what you turned to when everything else was cold or sour or growing something fuzzy, and in that role, they became something more. Cheese curds weren't exciting, but they were reliable. They were what you reached for when you needed food that wouldn't betray you. The kind of snack that didn't judge, didn't compete, didn't surprise. Just filled you up and moved on with life. And in a world full of unpredictable weather, wars, and wildly temperamental bread, that mattered. Of course, not every curd was a masterpiece. Some were soft to the point of worry. Others had the texture of a poorly chewed boot. But with enough salt and just the right bite, they could transport you, not to another world, but to a moment of peace. A quiet bench outside a stone cottage, a lunch break in the field, a midnight snack by the embers of a fire. In these curds, people found something rare, comfort without pretense. Even the village cats knew it. Toss a bit of curd their way and you earned their loyalty, or at least 10 minutes of it. Children would trade them under the table. Bakers might toss them into loaves, and for those enduring Lent or another long fast, curds offered a loophole. Technically not meat, definitely not sinful, delicious enough to feel like cheating, and so they endured. Through famine, through frost, through centuries of culinary experiments gone horribly wrong, the cheese curd stayed. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't famous. It didn't need to be. It was the snack equivalent of a wool blanket. Not fashionable, but always there when you needed warmth. And now, as you lay back beneath your own soft blanket, drifting towards sleep, imagine one last curd, still warm from the vat, gently squeaking in the hush of a monastery kitchen. Outside, the wind rustles through the ivy. Inside, a novice monk licks a finger and sneaks another bite. You smile because somehow you understand. The cheese curd didn't save the Middle Ages, but it made surviving them just a little easier. And in the quiet corners of history, sometimes that's more than enough. By now you've wandered through the smoky aroma of apple fritters and the soft, humble charm of cheese curds. You're starting to realize that medieval snacking was less about indulgence and more about making do, about turning whatever you had, or whatever hadn't gone bad yet, into something vaguely edible, and sometimes even sweet. Well, sort of. Tonight's tale comes not from the bustling street cart or the monastery pantry, but from the depths of culinary creativity, or perhaps desperation, because when apples were out of season, when sugar was a fantasy, and when life simply demanded dessert, someone, somewhere, looked at a turnip and thought, what if this could be pie? Let that settle for a moment. A turnip. That humble, slightly damp, often suspicious root vegetable. Hard to cut, harder to love, and known more for its survival value than its charm. But in the medieval world, turnips were cheap, available, and, crucially, not forbidden during religious fasts. So, someone decided to bake them, and thus the turnip pie was born. Now don't run just yet. Despite its tragic-sounding premise, turnip pie wasn't always a crime against taste. In fact, in the right hands, and with the right ingredients, and it could be not bad, maybe even good. Imagine this, a rough mash of boiled turnips, hopefully tender, maybe even peeled, mixed with a bit of egg if the chickens were cooperating. Perhaps a spoonful of honey or a handful of dried currants if the cook was feeling generous, or had something to prove. Then this soft, confused filling would be poured into a crust made of flour, water, and sheer ambition. The whole thing baked in a smoky oven until the edges browned, the middle set, and someone somewhere announced, "Dessert is ready." At its best, the result was warm and oddly comforting. A little sweet, a little savory. A texture somewhere between custard and vegetable stew. The flavor? Earthy, like pudding that went to live on a farm and came back slightly wiser at its worst. Well, let's just say it wasn't the turnips' fault. Sometimes they were overcooked, sometimes undercooked, sometimes so bitter they could strip the hope from a monk's soul. But even then, once it was baked into a crust and drizzled with honey, it passed. It passed as food. It passed as effort. And in the Middle Ages, effort counted. More than once someone at a feast would murmur, "What is this?" And another would reply, "Don't ask, just chew." Turnip pie was never meant to impress. It was meant to stretch what little you had into something warm and slightly celebratory, because dessert wasn't a rite, it was a small miracle. A culinary victory snatched from the jaws of root-cellar defeat. This pie became especially popular during Lent, when indulgence was forbidden, and monks, already experts in frugality, embraced it with the fervor of those who had no other choice. Some added spices, nutmeg if the abbey was wealthy, pepper if the cook was feeling chaotic. Occasionally raisins joined the party, confusing the flavor further but adding a surprising chew. And then there was the crust, thick, rustic and usually tougher than the sins it was meant to absolve. But it held everything together, which was more than you could say for many things in medieval life. You wouldn't find turnip pie in the halls of noble banquets, at least not unless a duke was pretending to enjoy simple peasant cuisine for political theatre. No, this was food for the commons, for fairs, for shared tables, for sleepy kitchens at the edge of a village, for people who knew how to make peace with limited options. And still, the pie endured. It became a sort of underground classic. Not because it was beloved, but because no one disliked it enough to stop making it. Children grew up on it. Grandmothers perfected their version. Recipes, if they could be called that, were passed down not on paper, but in stories, gestures, and a little of this, a bit of that. Turnip pie became tradition, in the way that some things do, slowly, quietly, without asking permission. And so tonight, as you lie there, the room dim, the blanket warm, the world outside gently fading, picture a hearth in a cottage somewhere, long ago. A wooden table, a round pie cooling on its surface. The fire crackles. A tired mother hums to herself, slicing wedges for her children. There's no feast, no festival. Just a quiet moment, a warm pie, and the knowledge that even a turnip can become dessert if you believe in it hard enough. It's not cheesecake. It never tried to be. But it showed up. And sometimes, that's all you need. Some foods demand applause, others merely understanding. And then there's turnip pie again. Yes, we're not done with it quite yet. Because if you think the story of root vegetable dessert ended with a single bake and a hopeful drizzle of honey, think again. The turnip, ever ambitious in its quiet, lumpy way, wasn't satisfied being just edible. It wanted more. It wanted to be cake. And honestly, you kind of have to respect that. The idea wasn't entirely absurd. In a world where sugar was rare and apples seasonal, cooks were forced to ask the tough questions. What can I bake that won't poison the children, disgust the abbot, or make the entire village talk behind my back? The answer, surprisingly, often was some version of root mash encased in flaky resolve. But to pretend it was cake, that took imagination and blind hope. And maybe just the right amount of culinary delusion. Let's set the scene. It's the day before a harvest festival. There are guests coming, maybe even the Reeve's daughter, who judges food with the eyes of a hawk and the mouth of a spoiled dove. There's no fruit left. The last of the honey went into bribing the beekeeper after a misunderstanding involving a goat. All that's left is a sack of turnips and the memory of joy. So, what do? You dream. You peel those turnips. You boil them into submission. You mash them like your social standing depends on it. Then you mix them with eggs, or what passes for eggs after a long week, and whatever sweeteners you can gather. Honey if you're lucky, raisins if you're bolder, and if desperation truly strikes, bits of dried carrots soaked in optimism, spices. Perhaps, if you're in a well-connected monastery, a pinch of nutmeg might find its way in. If you're chaotic neutral, you add black pepper. If you're out of both, you just call it rustic and move on. Next, you take the crust, that glorious flowery canvas of ambition, and press it into shape. It may crack, it may cry, so may you, but it holds, it must. Because this is not just a pie. This is an act of identity. A declaration that even when the cupboard is empty and your guests are skeptical, you will serve something round, golden, and vaguely dessert-shaped. The turnip mixture goes in. You pat it smooth. Maybe press a dried fig on top if you want flair. Then into the oven it goes. Not a modern convection oven, but a fire brick box that hisses back at you when fed. You watch the crust brown. You smell hope. Or at least something hot and unfamiliar. When it's finally done, you let it cool, slice it carefully, and carry it out with pride. And here's the thing, people eat it. They hesitate at first, their eyes narrow, their noses twitch. But then, a bite, a pause, a thoughtful chew, and perhaps a second bite. Because you see, while it's not cake in the fluffy, frosted choir of angels sense, it's cake in spirit. It's warm, it's sweetish. It gives the illusion of indulgence, which is often just as powerful as the real thing. Children don't love it, but they'll eat it. Elders nod approvingly, and even the Reeves' daughter, she of the delicate sensibilities, takes a small slice, dips it in a puddle of honey, and declares it interesting, which in medieval food terms is basically a standing ovation. The pie did it. The turnip pulled it off, not beautifully, not effortlessly, but convincingly enough to be invited back next year. And here's the deeper truth. In the Middle Ages, good enough was often the goal. People didn't expect magic from their desserts. They expected calories, warmth, a feeling of being full without regret, and maybe, just maybe, a brief moment of joy. Turnip pie offered that. In its humble, slightly bitter, occasionally over-salted way, it offered comfort. More importantly, it offered possibility. It said, you don't need berries or almonds or a pastry chef blessed by the Pope. You just need roots, patience, and imagination. It was the triumph of culinary realism, when you couldn't afford a feast but still wanted to end your meal with something round, warm, and mildly festive. In this way, turnip pie, especially the kind pretending to be cake, became a quiet hero of the medieval kitchen. So tonight, as your breathing slows and the room darkens, picture this: a stone cottage, a wind outside, brushing against the tea shutter. Inside, the fire is dying, the dishes are done, and on the table, a half-eaten turnip pie. It's cooled now, its crust slightly cracked. But someone, maybe the cook, maybe a child, takes one more slice, not because they're hungry, but because it feels like the right way to end the day. And in that moment, that quiet, flickering, final bite, the turnip becomes cake. Sleep well, dear listener. Tomorrow we meet a very different pie, one filled not with vegetables, but with mystery and meat. After the humble charm of turnip pie, which, let's be honest, did its best, we now arrive at a snack with swagger. A snack with secrets. A snack that doesn't ask for permission or apologize for its messiness. Welcome to the world of the meat pasty. Now, if you're imagining a neatly folded pastry with delicate crimps and artful plating, lower your expectations gently. These were not Pinterest pies. These were medieval survival tools that happened to be delicious, more or less. Imagine a crescent-shaped hand pie stuffed to the brim with seasoned meat, or something resembling meat, sealed tight and baked until the crust turned golden or slightly scorched, depending on the mood of the oven and the attentiveness of the cook. The meat pasty was the ultimate medieval portable meal. It didn't need a plate. It didn't need a fork. It didn't need dignity. You could eat it in the fields while watching over sheep, on the road while dodging bandits, at a fair, between watching a juggler and narrowly avoiding being pickpocketed, or more famously at public executions, where entertainment and lunch were disturbingly adjacent. The beauty of the pasty lay in its design. The crust was thick, often overly so, and folded in a way that created a sturdy edge, not for eating, but for holding with dirty hands. Once the filling was devoured, the soiled crust could be tossed aside, or if you were feeling spiritual, offered to the local spirits, or if you were practical, to the rats. So either way, someone got a snack. But let's talk about the filling. The mysterious, murky, glorious filling. Meat, in this context, was a flexible term. If you lived near a manor or a well-stocked abbey, you might get pork, mutton, or venison. The good stuff. The kind of meat you could identify on sight. If you lived elsewhere, and most people did, your options expanded dramatically. Rabbit, pigeon, hedgehog, eel. Yes, eel. Sometimes songbirds, sometimes bits of fish, sometimes unidentifiable cuts that were seasoned heavily enough to mask both origin and age. The pasty, you see, was not just food, it was camouflage, and that's what made it perfect. It didn't matter if the meat was fresh, it mattered that it was hot. It didn't matter if it was game or guesswork. It mattered that it stayed in your stomach until dinner. The crust sealed in flavor, kept out dirt, and made every bite a small gamble. And spices? They were the real magicians. Pepper was used generously, if not to improve taste, then to disguise it. Garlic, sage, and mustard seeds joined the fray. Anything that could make yesterday's leftovers feel like today's victory. And yet even with all this mystery, people loved them. Why? Because in a world where lunch often meant dry bread and cold water, a steaming, savory pocket of meat felt like royalty. It was comfort. It was calories. It was, at times, the most exciting part. Of the day, there were even vegetarian versions, though calling them that might be generous. They were often filled with leeks, onions, cheese, or turnips, again the ever-present turnip making another appearance, reserved for fasting days, or cooks low on animals and high on creativity. But make no mistake, the meat versions were the stars. They were the medieval equivalent of a food truck favorite. You didn't ask too many questions. You bit in and you hoped the cook had been in a good mood, or at least sober. Ownership was a serious business. Miners and laborers would carve their initials into the crust before baking, marking their claim. In flaky pastry, sometimes symbols were used, a fish shape for fish fillings, a cross for no meat, a mystery glyph for surprise. In Cornwall, a region that famously made the pasty a cultural icon, it said that the crust's thick edge allowed tin miners to hold the pasty with arsenic-covered fingers, eat the middle, and discard the edge, protecting their meal from poison. Whether fact or local legend, it speaks to the pasty's brilliance, edible, adaptable, and just cautious enough to survive. And survive it did. These hot, pocket-sized pies traveled with soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, and peasants. They were found at roadside inns, castle kitchens, and street corners. If you had flour, fat, and whatever animal was having a bad day, you had the makings of a pasty. Of course, they weren't without their risks. Sometimes the meat was a little too aged. Sometimes the crust was hard enough to chip a tooth. Sometimes, let's be honest, it moved a little before it was done cooking, but that was part of the charm. You didn't eat a pasty to feel safe. You ate it to feel full, to feel warm, to feel just for a moment like the world was manageable. And as you lie there now, the hum of the night around you, imagine a fire-lit tavern. Outside, rain slicks the stone streets. Inside, a young traveler sits at the corner table, hands wrapped around a still steaming pasty. They bite in cautiously, eyes wide. The crust crunches, the filling steams, the flavor is uncertain, but oddly satisfying. They smile because whatever it is, it's better than turnip pie, and that in the Middle Ages was enough. Sleep soundly, traveler. Tomorrow, we cleanse the palate with something sweet and suspiciously crunchy. After greasy crusts and mysterious meats, after the humble turnip's repeated attempts to win our hearts, you might be wondering, where's the sweet relief? Where's the sparkle, the glamour, the breath freshener? Well, dear listener, here it comes, tiny, crunchy, confusing, and unexpectedly fierce. Let us now open the small gilded box of medieval indulgence and meet candied fennel seeds. You may be tempted to laugh. A seed. As dessert. As mouthwash. Oh yes. But not just any seed. These were sugar-coated whispers of herbal sophistication, the medieval cousin to breath mints. If your breath mints could also break a tooth and be used in low-level spellcraft. Imagine yourself in a noble hall, dinner candles still flickering, the table littered with poultry bones and the faint odor of stewed onions. Across from you sits a baron, whose mustache has absorbed more gravy than humanly acceptable. Dessert has been served, a generous slab, of honey cake, possibly a prune, and now, as the final gesture of refinement, a servant appears, not with wine, not with cheese, but with a small carved dish. Inside, a gleaming pile of tiny white pebbles. Candied fennel seeds, my lord, the servant intones, as if announcing royalty. The baron nods, scoops a few, and chews thoughtfully. And just like that the evening is elevated. These seeds, sugar-dipped, hardened, and faintly licorice in taste, were the finishing touch to a feast, a ritual of cleanliness, of digestion, of breath made presentable before one began polite conversation or low-stakes flirtation. But don't be fooled by their dainty appearance. These seeds were not for the faint of enamel. The sugar shell around each one was boiled, beaten, poured, and dried, often multiple times, until it reached a density that could only be described as medieval. Her single seed was like biting into the concept of crunch. If your timing was off, your molars paid the price. But if you did it right, the slow chew, the careful pressure, you were rewarded. First, the crunch, then the sweetness, and finally, the unmistakable herbal burn of fennel. It was a flavor that split the table. Half the room smiled. The other half quietly swallowed and hoped no one noticed. Because fennel is bold, it's confident. It doesn't ask if you're ready for it. It arrives with the kind of licorice blast that makes you sit up straighter and question your life choices. Yet in the Middle Ages, that exact quality made it popular. People believed fennel aided digestion, especially after a meal that included, say, 3 types of bird, a questionable sausage, and a suspiciously chewy pie. Fennel soothed the stomach, they said. It warded off bad spirits. It made the breath acceptable, if not pleasant. And in an era where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, that counted for something. Of course, not everyone got the deluxe version. Nobles enjoyed imported sugar and carefully coated seeds, possibly flavored with rosewater or saffron. The common folk? Well, they got the knockoff version. Seeds tossed in honey, maybe rolled in ash or dried herbs if you were lucky. Still sweet, still crunchy, still vaguely medicinal, and still better than nothing. For those who could afford the real thing, candied seeds became status symbols, the end note of a feast. The sparkling finale that whispered, "Yes, I may smell like goose fat, but now I also smell of minty mystery." They were also tiny gifts, tokens of hospitality, handed out at weddings, feasts, or awkward political dinners where no one wanted to talk about the taxes. In some households, they were stored in ornate jars, displayed like edible jewelry, and on feast days, they sparkled like treasure. Children were fascinated by them. Monks hoarded them. Travelers carried them in pouches, partly for freshening their breath, partly for pretending to be noble when passing through villages. And just like modern mints, they were often consumed far too quickly, followed by the familiar regret of biting too hard, too soon. But let's not forget, these were not just snacks. They were tiny symbols of control. In a world of chaos, of muddy streets, political uprisings, questionable water, here was a moment of crisp sweetness, a ritual, a pause, a delicate, sugar-coated illusion that everything was, just for now, under control. And in that illusion, people found comfort. They knew the feast might give them indigestion. They knew the wine had turned. They knew that tomorrow they'd wake up and eat cabbage again. But tonight they'd had candied fennel seeds, they'd crunched, they'd smiled, they'd survived. And maybe if they closed their eyes, they could pretend it was peppermint. So now as the night deepens around you, imagine a velvet-draped dining hall gone quiet. The candles burn low. A servant passes through, collecting empty goblets. And on the corner of one plate, forgotten but glinting in the firelight, one last fennel seed remains, a lone crunchy survivor. It waits, sweet, spiced, slightly dangerous, just like every good medieval indulgence. Sleep well, dear listener. Tomorrow, we journey to the realm of honey cakes, where sweetness is a brick and dessert doubles as construction material. If candied fennel seeds were the final whisper of a medieval feast, crunchy, mysterious, and faintly herbal, then what came before them was bolder, denser, stickier. Tonight, dear listener, we turn our gaze to the golden heavyweight of medieval. Dessert tables, the one, the only honey cake. Sweet, chewy, alarmingly firm. Not so much a dessert as an architectural feat. One part indulgence, one part hazard, and entirely too sticky to eat without commitment. Honey cakes were in many ways the showpiece of the pre-sugar era. Before cane sugar became a common indulgence, before frosting dripped from pastries and icing became the language of celebration, there was honey, and honey in the Middle Ages was magic, golden, glorious, gift of bees and forests and slightly angry swarms. Honey was more than a sweetener. It was a healer, a preservative, a currency, and occasionally a weapon, usually against ants. But most importantly, it was the heart of this cake. So what exactly was a honey cake? Imagine a slab, firm, browned at the edges, possibly studded, with dried fruits if the cook had both resources and mercy. It was made with flour, often coarse, and water, sometimes ale, sometimes milk, depending on the budget and bravery of the kitchen. Then came the honey, generous, golden, and almost reverent in its application. Poured mixed or on in the more luxurious recipes, even drizzled again after baking for that sticky, glistening finish. Spices joined the party when possible. Nutmeg, clove, cinnamon. If you had access to the spice trade or a particularly well-traveled monk, your cake might have tasted exotic. For everyone else, the spice was hope. You added what you had, called it festive, and served it with confidence. The result? Dense, chewy, sweet in that slow molasses kind of way, and absolutely determined to stick to every surface it touched, including your hands, your plate, your teeth, and your dignity. These weren't delicate slices served on porcelain. These were cakes that could be dropped, stepped on, and still eaten. They were feast food, yes, and often appearing at weddings, festivals, and religious celebrations, but they were also practical. You could bake them in advance. They didn't spoil easily. And in times of famine or fasting, a small slice of honey cake could taste like joy. In some monasteries, they were made weekly. In others, only on saints' days. But when they appeared, you knew something good was happening, or at least trying to. Now let's talk texture. Modern cake is soft, airy, fluffy. Honey cake was not that. It was firm, often so dense it could stand upright on its own, unsliced. Knives were required. Strong wrists were preferred, and once you cut it, the slice held shape with military precision. There was no crumble, no fluff, just a chewy interior that hugged your molars like a long-lost cousin. That might sound unappealing, and yes, to some, it was. But it was also deeply satisfying. This was cake that lasted, a food that felt like a meal, something you could bite into and think, yes, I will survive winter. Children adored it, mostly for the sugar, less for the chewing effort. Adults respected it. And as for monks, well, it was the closest thing they got to fun that didn't involve Latin puns or illuminated manuscripts. Of course, honey cakes had their quirks. Left uncovered, they hardened into dessert fossils. You could, in theory, break a window with one. They also stuck to surfaces with a clinginess that rivaled old regrets. If you dropped one near the fire, you either left it or accepted that your next 3 meals would taste faintly of ash and bees. Still, they were beloved, used as gifts, as bribes, occasionally as subtle insults. I made this just for you, someone might say, handing over a slightly burnt, exceptionally sticky slab. It was sweet, but firm, much like the recipient. In noble homes, honey cakes were dressed up, stacked, sliced, layered with fruits or cheese. In villages, they were humbler, baked in stone ovens, wrapped in cloth, and eaten slowly, often with ale or warmed milk. No matter the setting, they signaled celebration. You didn't eat honey cake because you were bored. You ate it because something, anything, had gone right. And in the Middle Ages, that was reason enough. So tonight, as you lie beneath your blanket, safe from the cold winds and the call of unfinished chores, picture a wooden table, a flickering candle, a family gathered round. In the center sits a honey cake, still warm, still fragrant, still stubbornly intact. A knife presses in, slowly, firmly. A slice emerges. Someone smiles, because in that moment, in the chew, the Sweetness, the faint crackle of crust. There's more than dessert. There's comfort, there's continuity. There's joy wrapped in honey and ancient flour delivered from oven to soul. Sleep well, dear one. Tomorrow we crunch our way into the sea, with fried fish skin and stories of salt and sizzle. After the dense, sticky embrace of honey cake, a dessert that clung to your teeth and your calendar, let us now sail somewhere entirely different. Somewhere saltier, crispier, and considerably less sweet. Tonight, dear listener, we cast our nets into the realm of the unexpectedly delicious. We're talking about fish skin cracklings, yes, you heard that right, not fillets. Not stews, not fancy seafood platters served on beds of herbs. No, we're going right for the scraps, the cast-offs, the thin, glistening, slightly judgmental layer between the fish and your pride. Because in the Middle Ages, nothing went to waste, especially not if it could be fried. Fish skin cracklings were, by all accounts, an accident, the kind of snack born from someone staring at a pile of leftovers and saying, well, what if? And like so many great inventions, the wheel, the sandwich, the strangely addictive nature of dried peas. It started not with elegance but with curiosity, and a pan full of bubbling fat. Let's set the scene. It's late afternoon in a coastal village. The tide has just gone out, leaving behind wet sand, wooden boats, and the unmistakable smell of sea and sweat and scales. Inside a small kitchen, someone is cleaning fish, likely herring, cod, or something that looks angry even when dead. The meat goes to the stew, the heads go to the cats, and the skins. At first they're simply tossed aside, but then someone practical and hungry hesitates. They hold up a glistening strip of fish skin, translucent, rubbery, slightly disturbing, and they think, what if this sizzled? So into the pan it goes, hot fat, possibly lard, possibly oil, possibly something left from yesterday that still hisses when provoked. The skin hits the surface, and just like that, it transforms, it curls, it crackles, it crisps, and suddenly, this former trash becomes treasure. A snack is born. Now, to be clear, this wasn't fine dining. Fish skin cracklings were never meant for banquets or feasts. They didn't arrive on silver platters or earn poetic odes from medieval bards, but they earned something better: loyalty. Fishermen packed them for long days at sea. Peasants sold them outside taverns. Sailors chewed them as they watched the horizon, and drunkards loved them, salty, loud, and flavorful enough to drown out poor decisions. When done right, these cracklings were paper-thin and golden, with a crunch that echoed. They tasted like the sea, the fire, and a hint of defiance. A little salt helped, a pinch of garlic or herbs. Luxurious. But even plain, they satisfied, and importantly, they lasted. Dried, fried, or wrapped in cloth, fish. Skins could survive travel. They were light, rich in fat, and perfect for anyone doing the hard work of hauling nets, chopping wood, or surviving January. There were, of course, complications. Scales. Some cooks removed them, others didn't bother. This led to occasional, awkward crunches that felt more like penance than pleasure. But again, this was the Middle Ages. Standards were adaptable. Then there were the shapes. Fish skin doesn't fry flat. It twists, curls, folds into odd, sometimes menacing little spirals that look like edible punctuation marks. Some resembled question marks, others tiny horns. Some simply coiled into strange symbols, like the snack version of medieval calligraphy. Still, people loved them, not because they were beautiful, but because they were clever, efficient, delicious in a sharp, salty, strangely satisfying way. And they came with stories. Children were told they gave you a sailor's bravery. Monks claimed they helped with memory, though it's unclear whether they meant for scripture or for chores. And more than one superstitious cook believed that crackling fish skin before a storm could calm the waves, or at least the nerves of the crew. Of course, not everyone adored them. Nobles, for instance, turned up their noses, unless the skin came from exotic fish and had been triple fried in imported oil. and some overly sensitive diners objected to the smell, which, to be fair, was persistent. If you fried fish skin indoors, your home would carry that aroma for a week, maybe longer. It clung to walls, curtains, and the souls of your ancestors. But for those who braved the smell, the reward was glorious. A snack that was hot, crispy, and dangerously addictive. So tonight, as your eyes begin to close and the room darkens like the deepening sea, imagine this: a firelit hut near the shore. The walls lined with nets and hooks, and a sleeping dog that's clearly seen better days. A cook stands at a wooden table, lifting a tray of freshly fried cracklings. They glisten in the firelight. A child reaches for one, too hot. A sailor takes three. And the crackle, that beautiful, sharp, perfect sound, echoes in the tiny space. Outside, the waves lap gently. Inside, someone chews slowly, smiles, and sighs. Because even in a world of boiled cabbage and questionable sausages, sometimes, just sometimes with the leftovers sing, "Sleep well, dear one. Tomorrow we return to the land, counted with stale bread, soaked in ale and warmed by hope." There's a kind of comfort that comes not from luxury but from invention, from looking at what's left, shrugging a little, and making something edible. And that, dear listener, brings us to one of the most deeply medieval snacks of all, a dish born from desperation, from creative reuse, from a lack of refrigeration and an even more dramatic lack of standards. Let us talk about ale-soaked bread, known in some corners of the Middle Ages as sops or trencher toast, but more accurately described as warm, soggy resilience. To understand this dish, you need only imagine two things: bread that's gone too hard and ale that's gone too flat. Combine both, add a dash of medieval optimism, and voila, dinner or breakfast or survival snack between chores. Let's start with the bread. We're not talking about fluffy loaves, fresh from an artisan bakery. No, medieval bread was firm, often coarse, sometimes baked so densely it could serve as a paperweight or in emergencies a very small hammer. By the second or third day, it had hardened into what we might call culinary regret. But in a world that wasted nothing, old bread was never thrown out. It was reimagined. Enter the ale. Now again, this wasn't modern ale, brewed in stainless steel tanks and finished with notes of citrus. This was medieval ale, brewed in someone's smoky backroom, weak in alcohol, cloudy in color, unclear in hygiene, but it was wet, it was fermented, and, crucially, it was safer than water. So here's the method. Take your hardened bread, place it in a bowl, wooden if you're common, ceramic if you're lucky, a hollowed out cabbage if you're desperate. Now pour ale over it, slowly, let it soak. The bread will resist at first, proud, stubborn, jaw-breaking, but eventually it gives in. It softens, it swells, it becomes something else. Something between porridge and pudding, between sadness and soup. The result, a steaming bowl of ale bread, warm, bittersweet, vaguely nutty, faintly sour and utterly comforting in a way that only necessity can create. It was quick, it was filling, and it was oddly satisfying. Was it delicious? Well, under the right candlelight with a generous imagination. Yes, especially if your expectations were properly adjusted. But people didn't eat ale-soaked bread for fun. They ate it because it worked. It warmed the stomach. It softened the day. It made use of what was otherwise headed for the compost heap, had compost heaps existed, and it was versatile. On special occasions, or when the cook was feeling experimental, herbs were added. A sprig of thyme, a pinch of parsley, maybe even an onion if you were feeling wild. If you were truly blessed, a small knob of cheese might be crumbled on top, or an egg, fried, poached, possibly just waved at by a chicken. In wealthier homes or monasteries, the ale might be spiced, nutmeg, clove, cinnamon. If you closed your eyes, you might even pretend it was dessert, but most of the time, it was just you, your bowl, and the quiet knowledge that this was enough. In fact, ale bread was so common, It appeared in records from across Europe, from monastic accounts to peasant inventories to noble feast logs, always listed humbly but consistently, because it was reliable. In times of plenty, it was a side dish. In times of scarcity, it was the meal, and when eaten slowly with a spoon carved from bone or a sliver of wood passed down through generations, it became something almost sacred, a ritual of transformation, stale into soft, flat into full despair into dinner. And so now, dear listener, as the rain whispers against your window and the warmth of your blanket settles over you, picture this, a one-room cottage. The fire is low. A pot simmers gently. A mother stirs with one hand, cradles a child with the other. In the corner, an old man sits with a bowl of challah bread. He spoons slowly, chews thoughtfully. Outside, the world is uncertain. Inside, the bread is soft again. The ale is warm, and everything, just for now, is enough. Sleep well, traveler. Tomorrow, we explore how nobles did it differently, soaking bread in wine and calling it in dessert. Yesterday, we sank our teeth, or rather our spoons, into the humble world of ale-soaked bread, a dish born of hard crusts and harder times. But tonight, we turn the candlelight towards something more refined, still soggy, still bread, but now elegant, noble, drizzled with ambition. Welcome to the table of sops in wine, the medieval upper class's answer to dessert, diplomacy, and the eternal question, what if toast was emotional? Let's begin with the basics. Sops, spelled variously as soppes, soppe, or simply that thing at the bottom of my goblet, were essentially pieces of bread soaked in a liquid. The name itself came from the old French souper, meaning to soak, and soak they did. While peasants were dunking stale crusts into flat ale and calling it a miracle, nobles took that same idea, swapped out the beverage, added ceremony, and declared it fine dining. Enter wine. Not just any wine, of course. This was spiced wine, often mulled with honey, cinnamon, cloves, and sometimes a dash of vinegar to confuse your palate just enough. The kind of wine that felt more like a potion than a drink. You'd take toasted bread, ideally not fresh, not too old, and gently lower it into a bowl of this aromatic elixir. The toast would soak, swell, and soften into something between pudding and poetic symbolism. Then, with a spoon, silver, perhaps pewter, you'd eat it slowly, delicately, like it wasn't just wet bread. And for a moment, maybe it wasn't, because sops in wine were more than food. They were an experience, a ritual, a performance of wealth and leisure. Think of it like this. If challah bread was a blanket, sops in wine were silk, slippery, sweet, confusingly luxurious. They made frequent appearances at banquets, especially those hosted by lords who wanted to appear worldly. And by worldly, we mean aware of at least two spices and confident about the concept of dessert. Sometimes they were served at the end of a feast as a palate cleanser. Sometimes in the middle, during long, awkward pauses between courses when no one wanted to bring up politics. And occasionally they were the entire course, an ode to indulgence served in ornate bowls with tiny spoons and even tinier bites. Now, you might ask, why? Why take bread, humble, chewy, functional, and turn it into a wine sponge? Well, in the Middle Ages, extravagance had layers. Soaking bread in wine wasn't just about flavor. It was about symbolism, about absorbing the richness of the moment, about literally taking in the essence of the meal, wine, spice, sweetness, and making it part of yourself. It was, in its own strange way, a metaphor for the feast, and if it confused your guests into thinking they'd eaten something memorable, well, all the better. Of course, like most noble traditions, it occasionally got out of hand. Some cooks began adding dried fruits, raisins, figs, prunes. Others threw in nuts or drizzled honey on top. A few even cracked an egg into the mix, which turned the Aesop from delicately decadent to culinary gamble. There were regional variations too. In Italy, Aesops might be soaked in sweetened wine with citrus zest. In France, They flirted with rosewater. In England, they leaned towards cinnamon and regret. But no matter the recipe, the concept remained. Take bread, soak it, make it noble. And believe it or not, it worked. To the noble class, sops were more than soggy slices. They were a mark of culture, a sign you had access to wine good enough to spare, bread soft enough to toast, and the time to sit and eat something that wasn't trying to impress, only to charm. Even the serving of sops carried drama. A footman would present the bowl. A lady might fan herself. A knight might squint suspiciously at the texture, and then together they would spoon, slowly, softly, like sipping secrets. Was it universally loved? No. Some people, especially visiting guests from less sop-happy regions, quietly questioned whether this was dessert or a dare. Others praised it as the most civilized way to get tipsy while pretending to eat. And peasants, well, they had opinions too. Soggy bread, they might mutter. We've been doing that for centuries, only ours doesn't smell like cinnamon. And diplomacy. Still, sops had staying power. They lingered in recipe books, in court records, in poetry. They were immortalized not for their taste, but for their symbolism. Soft, rich, unexpected. So now, dear listener, picture this. A velvet-draped hall. The fire burns low. The feast is nearly done. Goblets sit half empty. A few guests are leaning, dangerously in their chairs. A hush falls, and then from the kitchen a servant appears, carrying bowls. Inside, slices of toast float gently in a pool of dark, fragrant wine. A spoon is offered, a smile exchanged, and suddenly the room softens. For a moment, the bread is more than bread. It's poetry, it's pause, it's the quiet joy of being slightly full, slightly flushed, and gently indulged. So sleep now with that warmth in your chest. Tomorrow we'll journey back to the earth, to the chewy, sticky world of dried fruit and its tenacious hold on medieval hearts. After the indulgent ritual of sops in wine, where toast swam like nobility in fragrant goblets, we now return to something even older, even sweeter, and somehow a bit tougher on the teeth. Tonight, dear listener, we explore the sticky realm of dried fruit, the medieval snack that could survive a pilgrimage, a siege, or a very long sermon. Let's begin with a simple truth. Medieval people adored sweetness. But sugar, that was rare. Honey, precious. So when nature offered its own sugary miracles, in wrinkled, chewy, shelf-stable form, people paid attention. Dried fruit was the Middle Ages answer to candy, chocolate, granola bars, and festive desserts, all in one. It came in many forms: raisins, figs, prunes, dates, and if you were very lucky, imported apricots or candied citrus peels. Now, modern dried fruit comes in tidy plastic packets, sometimes with smiling mascots or resealable zippers. In medieval times, dried fruit came in rough cloth sacks or hand-thrown ceramic pots. Sometimes it came from the local orchard, sometimes it came by ship, having crossed deserts and seas, handled by dozens of traders before ending up in a noble pantry or an abbey kitchen. Let's talk raisins, the workhorse of the dried fruit family. Grapes were sun-dried in hot climates like Spain or Sicily, then transported in bulk. They were small, sweet, and made everything they touched vaguely festive. Added to porridge, pies, honey cakes, and meat dishes alike, they were the culinary version of a wink. But raisins had attitude. They stuck to your teeth. They disappeared into dough. They rehydrated unexpectedly, turning muffins into mysteries. And once spilled, they rolled everywhere, under tables, into rushes, and occasionally onto the sandals of unsuspecting monks. Then there were figs, the dignified cousins of raisins, bigger, earthier, full of seeds that doubled as ancient dental floss. Dried figs were sliced, stuffed, mashed, or stewed, depending on how ambitious the cook felt and whether guests were watching. They had a reputation for being both delicious and, shall we say, digestive. Dates were luxurious, rich, sticky, and filled with the kind of dark sweetness that felt almost scandalous. Imported from North Africa or the Levant, they were expensive and exotic. If someone offered you a date in a medieval banquet, you knew they either wanted to impress you or distract you from the fact that the venison was overcooked. Prunes were divisive. Some loved them, some feared them. All respected their power. Dense, chewy, and vaguely medicinal prunes showed up in pies, stews, and fasting menus. They were considered good for the humors, though what that meant varied wildly depending on who you asked and how recently they'd been to the apothecary. And then there were apricots, rare, imported, and usually spoken of in whispers. Preserved in honey, dried in shade, or occasionally candied in sugar if you had access to a royal kitchen. They were bright, tangy, and the fruit equivalent of a status symbol. Now, why all this drying? Simple. It kept fruit from going bad. Fresh. Fruit was seasonal and fragile, but dried fruit, now that was portable, long-lasting, and ideal for travel. Pilgrims packed it, monks stored it, sailors lived on it, and children hoarded it like treasure. Dried fruit was used in everything. Pies, where it added sweetness and chew. Porridge, where it softened into soft little explosions of flavor. Meat. Dishes, where it balanced the salt and fat with sugar and tang. A surprisingly effective contrast. It appeared in honey cakes, stews, and stuffings. In some regions, it was even ground into paste, mixed with nuts and spices, and rolled into little energy balls. Medieval trail mix, essentially. But not all dried fruit was joyful. Sometimes it was rock hard, or poorly stored, or crawling with the kind of surprises that made you reconsider dinner. A poorly dried fig could break a tooth, an oversugared prune could melt into sticky despair, and raisins, when left too long in a clay jar, could ferment into what historians politely call a learning experience. Still, despite these hazards, dried fruit held a special place in the medieval heart. It symbolized abundance. It whispered of summer in the depths of winter, and it turned even the simplest meal, a hunk of bread, a piece of cheese, into something worthy of pause. Even the act of eating dried fruit was a little ceremony. You picked a piece, you chewed slowly, you tasted the labor, the harvest, the drying, the storage, the journey. Each bite carried sun and time and care. And yes, a little danger too. So tonight, as you lie still beneath your blankets, close your eyes and imagine this: a small wooden table, a cloth pouch, inside, tiny treasures, wrinkled, sweet, waiting. You lift a fig, you bite. There's crunch, there's chew. There's a pause where you forget the day's worries and remember only that sweetness can be simple. It can be old. It can arrive in unexpected packages. Sleep well, dear one. Tomorrow we sink our teeth into something richer, something bolder. A snack that's fried, iron-rich, and not for the faint of heart. The blood pudding ball. Tonight, dear listener, we leave behind the sweet and the sticky, the dates, the raisins, the apricot-scented dreams, and step boldly into a darker, denser, and far more daring culinary chapter. Because sometimes comfort isn't delicate. Sometimes it's fried, it's savory, and it's unapologetically made from blood. Let us now speak in reverent tones of the blood pudding ball, a medieval marvel as bold as it was bewildering. The snack of choice for anyone who believed food should fight back a little. At first glance, it might not sound appealing. Fresh animal blood, mixed with oats, onions, suet, and spices, then shaped into orbs and fried until they're crisp on the outside, dense on the inside, and packed with more iron than a blacksmith's dreams. But stay with me, because these curious little orbs weren't just food. They were fuel. They were strategy. They were how medieval folks turned nothing into something and made it taste surprisingly good. Let's rewind. In a world without refrigeration, without supermarkets or storage, nothing, absolutely nothing, could be wasted. When an animal was slaughtered, every part had a purpose. The meat was roasted. The bones became broth, the fat was rendered, and the blood, well, the blood was cooked. That might sound macabre to modern ears, But for the medieval cook, it was efficiency with a side of daring. The base of a blood pudding ball began naturally with fresh blood, usually pig, though sheep or even cattle could substitute. The key was freshness, not just for safety but for texture. Then came the fillers, oats for bulk and binding, onions for sweetness, suet, which is hard beef fat, for richness, and spices, pepper, sage, thyme, to make the final product less bloody and more bistro. The mixture was stirred, thickened, then rolled into firm little balls, each one dense enough to be a meal and hearty enough to hold its shape through the most medieval of cooking methods, frying in animal fat. Yes, again with the lard. In great iron pans over open flames, these balls were browned, crackling and hissing, until they emerged with crisp, slightly blistered exteriors and steaming, savory centers. The taste? Bold, meaty, deeply satisfying in a way that almost made you forget what was in them, or at least made you not mind they were best served hot, fresh from the skillet, eaten by hand or with a crude wooden spoon, dipped in mustard sometimes, paired with ale always. Nobles might dress them up with rare spices. Peasants? They were just glad not to be eating turnip pie again. And yes, they could be eaten cold, though that required a certain fortitude. Congealed fat and coagulated oats are not everyone's idea of a mid-morning treat. Still, blood pudding balls endured. They were common at markets and fairs, sold hot and wrapped in cloth. Street vendors hawked them alongside roasted nuts and honeyed cakes. Soldiers packed them for the road, dense, high in protein and surprisingly durable. In winter, they were survival food. In celebrations, they were savory indulgence. In hangovers, probably miraculous, they were in many ways the meatball of the Middle Ages, but with more drama and significantly more history. And they weren't unique to one region. From England's black pudding to Germany's Blutwurst, France's boudin, noir to Spain's morcilla, blood-based dishes were found across Europe, each with its own shape, spice blend and story. But the core idea was the same. Don't waste. Make it hearty, make it last. Now, were they universally loved? No. Some people couldn't get past the concept. Others disliked the texture, a little too soft, a little too rich. But for those who embraced, them blood pudding balls were a kind of culinary badge of honor. You didn't nibble them, you committed. And in that commitment was something strangely beautiful, a reminder of how people found nourishment in places modern diners might avoid, how they turned necessity into comfort, and how, even in the most iron-heavy bite, there was a kind of warmth. So now, dear listener, as the night deepens and the fire burns low, picture this. A frost-bitten village, the scent of wood smoke in the air. Inside a small cottage, a pan sizzles. A cook, sleeves rolled, flips a dark little orb in hot fat. The room fills with savory steam. A child stirs, a dog noses the floor, and a humble plate of blood pudding balls waits on a wooden table. Dense, warm, fragrant, a bite is taken. A smile follows, because for all its daring, all its mystery, this snack delivers what every meal promises: satisfaction, stamina, and the strange comfort of food that reminds you you're still here. Sleep well, traveler. Tomorrow we move towards something flatter, something simpler, something laced with lard and layered with history, the medieval pancake. After the weighty drama of the blood pudding ball, a snack as rich as it was fearless, tonight we turn our gaze to something flatter, simpler, fried, of course, because in the medieval kitchen, everything was either boiled into submission or browned in fat. Welcome, dear listener, to the humble yet heroic medieval pancake. Now, before your mind conjures tall stacks with maple syrup, whipped cream, and cartoon butter pats, pause. This was no Sunday brunch. This was survival, made crispy. In the Middle Ages, a pancake meant something much different than what you'd find in a diner. There was no baking soda, no fluffy rise, no careful drizzle of Vermont's finest. Instead, imagine this: a ladle of thin batter, mostly made of flour, eggs, and water, or if you were lucky, ale, poured onto a hot iron griddle slick with pig fat. No non-stick pans, no spatulas with silicone handles, just fire, iron, and hope. The result? A round, lacy-edged, irregular little disc. Not quite soft, not quite crisp, sometimes chewy, sometimes burnt. Often both at once, and yet it worked. Because in a world where most meals involved chewing on roots or pretending boiled cabbage was exciting, a pancake was joy, a small, flat rebellion against blandness. Let's talk ingredients. Flour was the base, wheat if you were wealthy, or rye and barley if you lived where bread was more attitude than softness. Eggs added richness, assuming your hens were cooperative that week. Water was typical, but ale added a slight tang and a touch of cheer. No sugar, no milk, certainly no vanilla extract. Just a batter born of necessity, stirred by hand and poured with love, or at least resignation. Cooking was an adventure. You needed a fire, a flat surface, and enough oil to keep things moving. The griddle was often a large iron plate set. Over coals, the batter would hit the heat with a hiss, then spread into a vaguely circular blob. Timing was everything. Flip too soon. It tore too late. It burned. Too much batter. You got a pancake with ambitions too little. A sad cracker. But when done right, when the edges browned, the middle cooked through, and the smoke curled just so, you had something simple, hearty, and deeply comforting. Pancakes could be savory or sweet. Add onions, herbs, or garlic for flavor. Cheese. If you had it, yes please. Honey or syrup. Only if you were feeling festive. Sometimes pancakes were stuffed, with leftover vegetables, bits of meat, even mashed turnips. A portable meal, easy to eat with your hands or a dagger. Ideal for travel, work in the fields, or a midday bite. Between prayers and ploughing, and because they were flat and flexible, pancakes doubled as edible plates, no dishes to wash. Just chew. Medieval pancakes were also tied to ritual and religion. During Lent or fasting days, when meat and rich foods were forbidden, pancakes became the loophole, fried, filling, and technically allowed. Shrove Tuesday, the day before. Lent began, was a kind of pancake party, a final feast before the season of restraint. Households used up eggs, fat, and flour in one go, resulting in a joyful, greasy farewell to indulgence. And in monasteries, pancakes were often part of refectory, meals and plain, predictable, and served with a side of scripture. Quietly devoured by candlelight, one bite for the body, one thought for the soul. Pancakes, you see, bridged worlds. They were for peasants and nobles alike, served in castles and cottages, made in silence or celebration, eaten hot, cold, fresh, or forgotten, and they endured. Not because they were glamorous, but because they were dependable. You didn't need skill, just heat, batter, and a bit of fat. You didn't need ceremony, just a fork into your fingers and an appetite. But let's not pretend they were always perfect. Sometimes the batter was too thin. Sometimes the pancake stuck, tore, collapsed, or smoked up the whole hut. Sometimes it was too salty, or not salty, enough, or fell into the fire and was eaten anyway because, well, it was food. Still, there was something satisfying about making a pancake. Something primal. You mixed, you poured, you watched it change. And in a world where little else stayed the same, that transformation from batter to bite felt like a tiny triumph. So now, dear listener, as the night deepens and your blanket pulls close, imagine this: a stone cottage, a smoky hearth, an iron griddle, hot and waiting, a ladle dips, a circle sizzles, a child claps, a pancake is flipped, and for a few golden seconds, life feels warm, round, and exactly right. Sleep well, traveler. Tomorrow we explore the crisp, whisper-thin delight that danced between dessert and devotion, the medieval wafer. Last night we celebrated the flat and fried glory of the medieval pancake. But tonight, dear listener, we go thinner, crisper, lighter than parchment, more fragile than a promise whispered in the dark. Tonight we speak of the wafer, that delicate, Medieval wonder balanced perfectly between snack and sacrament. Wafers were the kind of food that didn't demand attention, until you bit into one and suddenly realized you were participating in centuries of culinary minimalism. They were simple, elegant, quiet, and like so many things in the medieval world, a little bit holy. Let's begin with what they were not. They were not the sugar-crusted, chocolate-dipped, cream-filled confections you find in modern grocery aisles. There was no Neapolitan rainbow, no vanilla swirl, no colorful plastic wrapper. No. These wafers were the real deal, flat, crisp, and born of batter, heat, and a pair of heavy iron plates that looked like medieval panini presses, crossed with religious icons. The basic recipe? Flour, water, eggs, sometimes a dash of honey if you were showing off, or a drop of rose water if you wanted to impress the neighbors. But for the most part, simplicity ruled. The batter, runny, almost like cream, was poured carefully onto one side of a hot iron mold. Then, with a gentle but confident motion, the top plate was brought down. Sizzle, steam, and silence, as all eyes waited for the moment of release. When the irons were pried apart, what emerged was a delicate disc, laced with patterns, religious symbols, floral designs, or whatever the iron's mold bore. It looked like art. It tasted like a crisp breeze that had studied theology. You didn't eat a wafer to get full. You ate it to contemplate, to pause, to feel that fragile crispness dissolve on your tongue like a well-kept secret. Wafers had many homes. They were sold by street, vendors outside churches, who with great enthusiasm and even greater stacks of wafer baskets greeted the faithful with edible temptation after Mass. They were served at feasts as palate cleansers, passed around between roasted boar and honey cakes, offering a moment of lightness in a world of heavy sauces and heavier politics. They were used in monasteries, sometimes as quiet, humble snacks, sometimes as part of liturgical baking, precursors to communion wafers that bridged the divine and the digestible. In fact, communion wafers were likely the most iconic and sacred form of this culinary art. Baked not for pleasure but for ritual, marked with crosses, blessed and used during the Eucharist, a literal taste of the sacred. But outside the altar, wafers were a people's snack, albeit one with a slight sense of performance. Vendors would shout, children would beg, adults would fumble coins from pouches, and the wafers, fragile, warm and whisper-thin, would crack and crumble in hands, on lips, and often in pockets before they could even be eaten. They didn't travel well. They broke under pressure. Literally, one wrong move and a stack of wafers would become edible. Confetti. But that was part of their charm. You didn't hoard wafers. You ate them quickly, sometimes right there in the street, standing outside the chapel, leaning on a cart, laughing with a friend, chewing thoughtfully, watching crumbs flutter to the ground. Some were plain, some were spiced, some were layered with soft cheese, a rich contrast to their crisp base. And for the noble or ambitious, wafers could even be used as a dessert base, topped with dried fruit, nuts, or a drizzle of syrup, a precursor to the tart, or perhaps just a medieval attempt to make biscuits fancy. But let's return to their structure. Wafers were fragile. They cracked if you looked at them funny, they shattered if dropped, and they bent if the air was too moist, turning from crisp to chewy in a heartbeat. Storing them required care. Transporting them? A prayer. Still they persisted. They were sold by the dozen, eaten by the dozen, and remembered, not for bold flavors, but for texture, for subtlety, for the pleasure of something so gentle it could only be truly appreciated when the world slowed down. And maybe that's why wafers mattered. In a time of heavy bread, dense pies, salted meats, and serious stews, the wafer was a whisper, a reminder that food could be light, that not every meal had to weigh on your stomach like a sermon on sin, that sometimes a moment of crisp, silent pleasure was enough. So now, dear listener, as the fire dims and the chill of night brushes against your thoughts, Imagine this, a quiet square, a church door just closed. The last few parishioners step into the dusk, and there, beside a pillar, a woman stands with a woven tray. In it, warm wafers, round, crisp, gold-edged. You reach out. You take one. It snaps with a sound like a secret breaking. You chew, and for a moment, everything is still, simple, sacred, and softly sweet. Sleep well, gentle dreamer. Tomorrow we visit something darker, something stickier, something soaked in syrup and served in jars like edible treasure, the indulgent mystery of sucket. Last night, we delved into the sweet world of candied fruits. Tonight, dear listener, we venture into the savory depths of medieval cuisine, focusing on a creature both revered and reviled, the eel. In the Middle Ages, eels were more than just a meal. They were a staple of the diet, a form of currency and a symbol of sustenance. Found abundantly in rivers and marshlands, eels were accessible to both peasants and nobility, making them a unifying element in the diverse tapestry of medieval society. The eel economy eels were so integral to medieval life that they often served as a form of rent payment. Landlords would accept eels in lieu of coin, and records from the 11th century indicate that over 500,000 eels were used annually for this purpose. This practice underscores the eel's value and the reliance of communities on this slippery resource. Culinary practices. Cooking eel required skill and care. One common method involved boiling the eel with herbs and spices to create a hearty soup. A simple recipe might include eels, cleaned and cut into pieces, water, mace, whole, pepper, onion, a bundle of sweet herbs like parsley, wild nettles or wild onions. The ingredients would be combined in a pot and boiled until the liquid reduced by half. The resulting broth would be strained and served over toasted bread, providing a nourishing meal for the weary eel delicacies beyond soups. Eels featured in more elaborate dishes. One such preparation involved skinning and deboning the eel, then stuffing it with a mixture of meat and spices. The eel would be sewn back together, cooked in red wine and presented as a delicacy. This dish, known as eels reversed, showcases the creativity and complexity of medieval cooking. Symbolism and superstition. Eels also held symbolic significance. In some cultures, they were associated with fertility and renewal due to their mysterious life cycle. However, their serpentine appearance led to superstitions, and some believed that eels possessed magical properties or were linked to the supernatural. A day in the life. Imagine a medieval kitchen. The hearth fire crackles, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. A cook, sleeves rolled up, tends to a pot where eel simmers with herbs. The aroma fills the room, mingling with the scent of baked bread and the earthy smell of the stone floor. Outside, a fisherman returns with a fresh catch, eels writhing in his net, ready to be transformed into sustenance. Modern reflections today, eel dishes like jellied eels or eel pies are rare delicacies, reminders of a time when this fish was central to daily life. As we reflect on these traditions, we gain insight into the resourcefulness and culinary ingenuity of our ancestors. So now, dear listener, as you rest in the quiet of the night, envision the warmth of the hearth, the sizzle of the pan, and the rich aroma of eel stew wafting through the air. Let these images lull you into a peaceful slumber, dreaming of medieval feasts and the humble eel's place in history. Last night we cracked open the jar of luxury known as sucket, candied fruit that stuck to your teeth and your sense of self-worth. Tonight, we return to earth, to the hearth, to something humbler, warmer, and considerably soggier. Dear listener, meat bread soaked in ale, the Middle Ages answer to French toast, minus the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or joy, but somehow still comforting. This dish had many names across regions and centuries. In England, it was sometimes called sops or soups, elsewhere simply ale bread, Whatever the name, the principle was delightfully, or perhaps desperately, simple. Take stale bread, soak it in ale, eat. It was born, like so many medieval inventions, not from inspiration but from inconvenience. Bread went stale, ale went flat. Together, they became a meal that somehow didn't offend anyone's expectations. Let's begin with the bread. In medieval kitchens, bread was everywhere, a cornerstone of the diet, both literal and symbolic. But bread in those days had no preservatives. After a day or two, it hardened into a substance more useful for self-defense than sandwiches. What to do? You soaked it. Now, the ale. Medieval ale was a far cry from today's craft brews with citrus, notes and poetic labels. It was often flat, yeasty, low in alcohol, and brewed in smoky kitchens under the dubious supervision of someone named Agnes or Oswin. Drinking water was unreliable. Ale was safe, nourishing, and when poured over stale bread, surprisingly edible. So the preparation went like this. Step 1. Find bread hard enough to injure someone. Step 2. Pour ale over it. Step 3. Wait. The bread absorbed the ale. Like a sponge with trust issues, it softened, swelled, and transformed into something between a pudding, a porridge, and a mistake. But here's the thing. It worked. In a world where calories were king, this soggy slab of grain and brew filled bellies and soothed souls, especially among the working class, who needed something quick, hot, and easy to digest after hauling stones, herding sheep, or surviving tax collectors. Sometimes people added things, herbs, a pinch of salt, maybe a scrap of cheese if the day had gone particularly well. On rare feast days, the ale might be spiced, turning the dish into a mildly celebratory mush. Think of it as the medieval version of upgrading your oatmeal, and for those truly living on the edge, a fried egg on top, if the hen was generous and no one else got there first. Now, you may wonder, was it good? The answer, like many things in medieval cuisine, is it depends. Was the bread only a little stale? Then yes, it could be warm, chewy, and oddly satisfying. Was the ale turning vinegary? Then no. It became a sour mess better fed to pigs or younger siblings. But for many it was reliable, a dish that wasted nothing. That could be made in minutes. That didn't require firewood, pans, or even utensils if you weren't feeling fancy. It was eaten from wooden bowls, clay pots, or whatever happened to be clean. Usually hot, sometimes cold, always with a sense of resigned gratitude. This wasn't a dish to impress. It was a dish to survive. And yet, it had its charm. There was something cozy about wrapping cold fingers around a bowl of ale-soaked bread. Something soothing in the steam that rose from the spongy surface. Something calming about not having to chew too hard after a long day of chewing through life. Even monks ate it, not during high feast days, of course, but on those quiet afternoons between prayers, chores, and silence, a bowl of soaked bread offered. Gentle nourishment without excess. It was food that asked nothing of you, except perhaps to lower your standards. But let's not dismiss it too quickly, because in its simplicity there was a kind of wisdom, a reminder that not every meal needs to dazzle, that not every day ends with honey cakes or candied citrus. That sometimes what you need most is warm, soft, and slightly fermented. So now, dear traveler, close your eyes and picture this. A cold afternoon. Rain taps gently against the shutters. Inside, a hearth glows, a pot simmers, and in a bowl, bread soaked in ale. Steam curls. A spoon stirs. You lift it. You taste. Warm, bready, barely bitter, and for reasons hard to explain, comforting. Sleep well, wanderer. Tomorrow, we move to something slightly stranger. A dish of wine and bread, nobility and confusion. The softly soaked world of sops in wine. Last night we delved into the humble comfort of bread soaked in ale, a dish born of necessity and simplicity. Tonight, dear listener, we elevate that concept, stepping into the realm of the refined, the indulgent, and perhaps the slightly tipsy. Welcome to the world of esops in wine, a medieval delicacy that straddled the line between dessert and accident, elegance and improvisation. At its core, a sop was simply a piece of bread soaked in liquid. In the Middle Ages, this could be broth, milk, or in our case, wine. But when wine entered the equation, the sopi transformed from mere sustenance to a dish of sophistication and subtlety. Imagine this: a slice of toasted white bread, its edges crisp to perfection, gently laid in a shallow bowl. Over it, a warm concoction of spiced wine and almond milk is poured, infusing the bread with flavors both sweet and aromatic. A sprinkle of sugar and a dash of cinnamon complete the ensemble, resulting in a dish that's both comforting and complex. This wasn't just food, it was an experience, a moment of indulgence in a world where such luxuries were rare. The ingredients: bread. Typically, a fine white bread, known as pain-main, was used. Its firm texture held up well to soaking, ensuring the esop didn't disintegrate into mush. Wine. White wine was preferred, often warmed and infused with spices like saffron, ginger, and cloves. The choice of wine added a layer of complexity and a touch of opulence. Almond milk. A staple in medieval cooking, almond milk provided a creamy base without the perishability of dairy. It was often sweetened and thickened to resemble a light custard. Spices and sweeteners. Sugar, a luxury item, was used sparingly, while spices like cinnamon and ginger added warmth and depth. The preparation. 1. Toasting the bread. Slices of pain-main were toasted until golden, providing a sturdy base for the esop. 2. Preparing the almond milk. Ground almonds were mixed with water and wine, then strained to create a smooth liquid. This was gently heated with saffron and sugar until slightly thickened. 3. Assembling the dish. The toasted bread was placed in a bowl moistened with a bit of wine, and then the warm almond milk mixture was poured over it. A final sprinkle of spice completed the presentation. The experience eating sops in wine was a multi-sensory experience. The aroma of spiced wine and almonds wafted upward, inviting the first bite. The texture combined the crispness of toasted bread with the softness imparted by the soaking liquid. The flavors danced between sweet and savory, familiar and exotic. In a time when meals were often dictated by necessity, sops in wine offered a momentary escape, a taste of luxury, a hint of indulgence. Cultural significance. Sops in wine were more than just a dish. They were a reflection of the times. They showcased the medieval penchant for combining sweet and savory, the use of spices to elevate simple ingredients, and the ingenuity in creating satisfying dishes with limited resources. Moreover, the dishes' reliance on almond milk highlighted the medieval approach to dietary restrictions, especially during periods like Lent, when dairy was prohibited. Almond milk provided a versatile and acceptable alternative, allowing dishes like sops in wine to be enjoyed year-round. A dish for all occasions. While sops in wine were certainly enjoyed by the nobility, variations of the dish found their way into more modest households. The ingredients could be adjusted based on availability, using different types of bread, substituting honey for sugar, or omitting certain spices. This adaptability ensured that sops in wine, in one form or another, became a beloved dish across different strata of medieval society. A modern reflection. Today, while we might not commonly soak our toast in spiced wine and almond milk, the essence of sops in wine lives on in dishes like bread pudding or French toast. These modern counterparts echo the medieval desire to transform simple ingredients into something comforting and special. So, as you settle into your bed, imagine the flickering candlelight of a medieval hall, the soft strains of a lute in the background and the warm spiced aroma of sops in wine wafting through the air. Let this gentle indulgence lull you into a restful sleep. Tomorrow, we explore the realm of medieval cheeses, a journey through textures, aromas, and the art of preservation. Sleep. Well, dear listener, last night we swirled our spoons through a bowl of spiced wine and bread, drifting gently into dreams sweetened with almonds and cinnamon. Tonight, dear listener, we turn to something smaller, chewier, older perhaps. Tonight, we chew, carefully, on the story of dried fruit. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit wasn't a pantry afterthought. It wasn't trail mix. It wasn't perched atop a yogurt parfait. It was treasure, wrinkled, tough, sticky. But treasure nonetheless. Let's begin at the source, the orchard. Imagine late summer in medieval Europe. The sun low, the trees heavy. Branches groaning under the weight of figs, dates, apples, and plums. A time of frantic gathering, slicing, laying out on woven mats. No food preservation apps, no vacuum-sealed bags, just sunlight and hope. Fruits were dried by the warmth of the sun, or smoked slowly over fire. Sometimes they were strung and hung in rafters, other times forgotten on windowsills and rediscovered weeks later, shrunken but miraculously still. Edible dried fruit was a miracle in many ways. It lasted. In a world where spoilage was the rule and fresh produce was a seasonal tease, dried fruit could endure. It could survive the long months of winter. It could travel. It could hide in pouches, nest in pies, or wait patiently in a monk's satchel until the right moment. But it came at a cost. First, the texture. You don't nibble dried medieval figs. You battle them. They were chewy, with seeds that crunch like gravel. Raisins were sticky little saboteurs that lodged themselves in teeth like they paid rent. Dates, soft and sweet, but dense enough to dislodge a filling, if medieval dentistry had fillings. Still, they were beloved because they were sweet, not sugary in the modern sense, but concentrated, fruity, and rich in a time when sugar was rare, and honey precious. One bite of dried plum could remind a peasant of summer in the dead of winter. A handful of raisins could transform a bland porridge into something borderline festive. The wealthy adored them. They were imported when local supply faltered, dates from North Africa, figs from the Levant. Dried apricots were a diplomatic delight. And when trade routes blossomed, even candied citrus peel made an entrance, fragrant and exotic. Dried fruit found its way into everything. It was tucked into honey cakes, crumbled over gruel, mixed with nuts and spices to make early forms of confections. It was served in banquets alongside cheeses, meats, and delicate wafers. Sometimes it stood alone, a bowl of wrinkled jewels passed around after supper, the candlelight catching on syruped skins. Other times it played a sneaky role, hiding in a turnip pie, adding chew to a tart, or pretending to be dessert all by itself. Children treated dried fruit like candy. On rare feast days, when a prune or fig appeared on a plate, it was savored slowly, sometimes hoarded in a pocket, sometimes hidden in a shoe for later. Sharing was optional. Regret was guaranteed. But dried fruit wasn't only for indulgence. It had a practical side too. It traveled well, packed into bundles for soldiers, pilgrims, or long journeys downriver. It offered quick energy in a world that demanded constant movement. A dried fig could power you through another mile, a date through another sermon. Even the monasteries valued it. Though monks lived simply, their gardens often produced fruit, and drying became part of the rhythm of the year. In cold cloisters and quiet kitchens, trays of apples and pears dried slowly, their sweetness deepening as the days shortened. And while dried fruit felt like a gift, it was also a luxury. For the poor, even a single fig was a feast. For the rich, it became a gesture, a token of hospitality, a romantic offering, even a political move. "Here," the message said, "I've spared this prune for you." A compliment that carried weight and stickiness. Of course, there were complications. Storage was tricky. Too much moisture, and you'd find mold. Too little, and your plum turned into a stone. Insects were always interested, and sometimes a batch would simply vanish, lost to children, rats, or a forgetful baker with too many pies and not enough memory. Still, they endured, because in their shriveled forms, dried fruits held something magical, a fragment of the sun, a memory of summer, a promise that sweetness could survive even the darkest winters. So now, dear listener, picture this. A long wooden table. Candles flicker low. Outside, the snow drifts. Inside, a hand reaches across the table. In its palm, a single dried fig. It is split open, sticky, dark, seedy. It is offered. It is accepted. And in that chewy bite is something rare. A taste of sun, a hint of joy, a small wrinkled echo of the orchard. Sleep. Well, wanderer, tomorrow we explore something round, rich, and iron heavy. A snack that dares to be bold, fried, and slightly fearsome. The blood pudding ball. Again. Wait, no. We've been there. Tomorrow, truly this time, we look to the medieval pancake. Thin, greasy, delicious, and fried with reckless hope. Last night, we wandered the chewy world of dried fruit, sticky, sweet, and occasionally dental risking. Tonight, dear listener, we ease into something flatter, fried, fragrant, and just a little bit burnt on the edges. Welcome to the comforting, slightly chaotic realm of the medieval pancake. Now, when you hear the word pancake, you might imagine a neat golden stack, dripping with syrup, fluffed like a pillow, served on a ceramic plate beside a mimosa and a weekend newspaper. But medieval pancakes had other plans. They were not fluffy. They were not stacked. They did not arrive with whipped cream or blueberries arranged in the shape of a smile. No. Medieval pancakes were practical pan-fried creatures, thin, chewy, and cooked in enough grease to make your arteries whisper warnings in the dark. And yet somehow they were exactly what the people needed. Let us begin, as all good pancakes do, with the batter. In medieval kitchens, recipes weren't written down. Cooks used instinct, memory, and the occasional divine intervention. A typical pancake mixture included flour, whatever grain was available, often wheat for the well-off, barley or rye for the rest. Eggs, precious but not impossible to find, especially if you were on speaking terms with your hens. Liquid, milk if you had a cow, ale if you didn't, water if you were feeling daring. Medieval water quality was a gamble. Ale was the safer bet. This was stirred together in a clay or wooden bowl using a spoon, or sometimes a stick that doubled as a stirring device in chicken skewer. Once the batter reached the proper consistency, somewhere between runny porridge and enthusiastic soup, it was time for the fire. Frying was a production. You needed a heavy iron griddle or skillet suspended over flame or set atop a pile of smoldering coals. It had to be hot. Not slightly warm, not politely ready, but sizzling hot, capable of turning lard into sound effects. Lard, by the way, was the frying fat of choice. Rendered pig fat, slippery, smoky, and absolutely everywhere. You'd ladle in the batter and listen. That sizzle? That was your cue that life, despite everything, had moments of joy. The pancake would spread in a lopsided circle, never perfectly round, always with a rogue corner or two. You'd wait until the edges crisped, then flip it using your best spatula-like object. A flat stick, a knife, or bare hands, if you were either brave or foolish. Timing was everything. Too early, and it tore. Too late, and it turned into a medieval tortilla, perfectly flipped though. You had something special, golden brown, crispy at the edges, and puffed just enough to catch the scent of ale and hearth fire. Flavor? That depended. On a humble day, the pancake was just flour, eggs, and fat eaten plain, folded in half, devoured while standing. On a good day, though, you might add a pinch of herbs, maybe thyme or parsley from the garden, or a drizzle of honey if the bees had been cooperative and the neighbors not too curious. In wealthier homes, spices might appear, saffron for color, cinnamon for warmth, or even a shaving of nutmeg, rare, expensive, and exotic. In such cases, the pancake ascended from food to festival. And what did you do with these pancakes? You rolled them, layered them, or tore them with your hands. You dipped them into broth. You used them as edible plates for cheese or vegetables. You wrapped them around bits of meat like primitive tacos. There was no etiquette, just chewing. They were often eaten hot off the griddle, burnt fingers and all, or left to cool and taken into the fields as a makeshift lunch, stacked into cloth bundles, crammed into satchels, forgotten at the bottom of barrels. They were portable, durable, and shockingly versatile. In fact, pancakes had seasonal importance too. On the day before Lent, a time when meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden, households scrambled to use up rich ingredients. Enter Pancake Day. It was a practical celebration. You cleared out the pantry, cracked the last eggs, used the remaining milk or lard, and fried your way into repentance. Pancakes were not just delicious, they were morally cleansing, and while they weren't considered luxurious, they had a kind of quiet comfort. A reminder that even in times of scarcity, something warm and fried could make you feel human again. Children loved them. Adults relied on them. Monks, despite their vows, occasionally indulged, especially if a traveler had dropped off a basket, in exchange for shelter or prayer. So now, dear listener, imagine this: a fire crackling low, a pan warming slowly, a dollop of batter poured with practiced grace, a hiss, a flip, a sigh, a pancake. Simple, savory, steaming. You tear it in half. Share it with a friend or don't, because in this moment under this roof with this warmth in your hands, there is no famine, no frost, no fear, just flour, fat, and fire. And that is enough. Sleep well, wanderer. Tomorrow, we explore something even thinner and possibly holier, the crisp, whispered delight of the medieval wafer. Last night, we savored the humble delight of medieval pancakes, greasy, golden, and unapologetically flat. Tonight, dear listener, we venture into a realm of delicate artistry and sacred symbolism. Welcome to the world of the medieval wafer. At first glance, a wafer might seem unassuming, a thin, crisp disc, light as air and fragile as a whispered secret. But in the Middle Ages, wafers held a significance that transcended their simple appearance. The sacred and the secular, wafers occupied a unique space in medieval society, straddling the line between the sacred and the secular. In religious contexts, they were central to the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, representing the body of Christ. These communion wafers were made with the utmost reverence, using only the purest wheat flour and water, and baked in irons bearing sacred symbols. But beyond the church walls, wafers took on a more festive role. They became a popular treat at fairs, feasts, and celebrations, enjoyed by nobles and commoners alike. These secular wafers were often enriched with ingredients like eggs, honey, and spices, transforming them into a delicacy that delighted the senses. Crafting the wafer. Creating wafers required both skill and specialized equipment. The batter, made from a mixture of flour, water, and sometimes eggs or honey, was poured onto a heated wafer iron. This iron consisted of two engraved plates, which, when pressed together, imprinted intricate designs onto the wafer as it cooked. The process demanded precision. The iron had to be heated to the right temperature. Too hot and the wafer would burn. Too cool and it wouldn't crisp properly. Timing was crucial, as was the pressure applied when closing the iron. The result was a wafer that was not only delicious, but also a miniature work of art. Designs and decorations. The designs imprinted on wafers varied widely. Religious wafers featured crosses, saints, and other sacred imagery. Secular wafers, on the other hand, showcased a range of motifs, from floral patterns to coats of arms, and even scenes from daily life. These decorative elements weren't merely ornamental. They reflected the wafer's purpose and the status of its consumer. A wafer bearing a noble's crest might be served at a grand banquet, while a simpler design might be found at a village fair. Wafers in society wafers were more than just a treat. They were a symbol of hospitality and celebration. At weddings, they were often served alongside spiced wine, marking the joyous union of two families. During festivals, wafer sellers, known as obloyeurs in France, would set up stalls near churches and marketplaces, offering their crisp confections to passers-by. In noble households, wafers were a staple of the dessert course, served with fruits, nuts, and sweet wines. Their delicate texture and subtle sweetness provided a perfect contrast to the rich and hearty dishes that preceded them. A delicate delight. Despite their popularity, wafers were notoriously fragile. Their thinness made them prone to breaking, and they absorbed moisture easily, losing their crispness if not stored properly. As such, they were often made fresh and consumed quickly, adding to their allure as a special, ephemeral treat. The legacy of the wafer, the medieval wafer's influence can still be seen today. Modern waffles, for instance, owe their origins to these early confections. The practice of imprinting designs onto baked goods has continued, evolving into various forms across different cultures. Moreover, the wafer's dual role as both a sacred symbol and a secular delight highlights the complex interplay between religion and daily life in the Middle Ages. It serves as a reminder of how food can carry profound meaning, connecting communities and traditions across time. So now, dear listener, as you settle into the quiet of the evening, imagine the gentle clatter of a wafer iron, the sweet aroma of honeyed batter, and the joy of biting into a crisp, delicate disc that carries with it centuries of history and tradition. Sleep well and dream of golden wafers and the hands that crafted them with care. Last night we savored the delicate artistry of medieval wafers, thin, crisp, and imbued with both sacred and secular significance. Tonight, dear listener, we delve deeper into the world of these fragile confections, exploring their evolution, cultural impact, and the subtle joy they brought to medieval life. The evolution of the wafer in the early Middle Ages. Wafers were primarily associated with religious rituals. Crafted with reverence, these unleavened discs symbolized spiritual purity and were integral to the Eucharist. Over time, however, the wafer transcended its ecclesiastical origins, finding a place in the secular world as a beloved treat. Artisans began experimenting with ingredients, adding honey, spices, and even wine to the batter. The once simple wafer transformed into a delicacy, enjoyed by nobles and commoners alike, served at feasts, fairs, and festive gatherings. The wafer iron, a tool of artistry central to the wafer's transformation, was the wafer iron, a hinged device with engraved plates that imprinted intricate designs onto the batter. These irons were often personalized, bearing coats of arms, floral patterns, or religious symbols. The resulting wafers were not only tasty, but visually captivating, reflecting the artistry and craftsmanship of their makers. Operating a wafer iron required skill and precision. The iron had to be heated to the right temperature, greased appropriately, and handled with care to ensure the wafer cooked evenly and bore the desired imprint. It was a delicate dance between fire and finesse. Wafers in daily life. Beyond their presence at grand banquets, wafers became a staple in everyday medieval life. Street vendors, known as obloyeurs, sold them near churches and marketplaces, offering a quick and affordable treat to passers-by. Children delighted in their sweetness, while adults appreciated their lightness after a hearty meal. In some regions, wafers were rolled into cones and filled with sweet creams or fruits, an early precursor to the modern ice cream cone. Their versatility and appeal made them a cherished part of medieval cuisine. Symbolism and significance. Wafers held symbolic meaning beyond their culinary value. Their circular shape represented eternity and unity, while their delicate nature reminded consumers of life's fragility. Sharing a wafer could signify friendship, love, or hospitality, making them a thoughtful gift or gesture. In literature and art, wafers often appeared as symbols of purity, celebration, and communal harmony. They were more than just food. They were a reflection of the values and aesthetics of the time. A modern reflection today, while wafers have evolved into various forms, cookies, cones, and communion hosts, their essence remains. They continue to bring joy, mark special occasions, and connect us to a rich culinary heritage. So now, dear listener, as you settle into the quiet of the evening, imagine the gentle clatter of a wafer iron, the sweet aroma of honeyed batter, and the joy of biting into a crisp, delicate disc that carries with it centuries of history and tradition. Sleep well and dream of golden wafers and the hands that crafted them with care. Last night, we explored the delicate world of wafers, crispy, sacred, and sweet. Tonight, dear listener, we descend into the cool, damp depths of the medieval cheese cellar, where time slows and milk transforms into gold. Welcome to the realm of medieval cheese. In the Middle Ages, cheese was more than food. It was a testament to patience, skill, and the alchemy of preservation. From humble cottages to grand monasteries, cheesemaking was both a daily chore and a revered craft. The art of cheesemaking began with fresh milk, cow, goat, or sheep, gently warmed and combined with rennet, an enzyme that curdles the milk. The resulting curds were cut, drained, and pressed into molds, then salted and left to age. The aging process was crucial. In cool stone cellars, cheeses matured over weeks or months, developing flavors ranging from mild and creamy to sharp and pungent. The environment, temperature, humidity, and even the presence of certain molds played a significant role in shaping the cheese's character. Monastic monasteries were at the forefront of cheese-making innovation. Monks, with their disciplined routines and access to resources, refined techniques and created cheeses that would endure for centuries. These monastic cheeses were often produced in large quantities, with meticulous records kept of recipes and aging times. The result was a variety of cheeses, each with distinct textures and flavors, reflecting the region's terroir and the monk's dedication. Varieties across regions, medieval Europe boasted a diverse array of cheeses. Brie originating from France, this soft cheese was enjoyed by both peasants and royalty. Cheddar, hailing from England, Cheddar was known for its firm texture and sharp taste. Roquefort, a blue cheese from southern France, aged in limestone caves with a distinctive tang. Gouda, from the Netherlands, this semi-hard cheese was prized for its rich, buttery flavor. Each cheese told a story of the land, the animals, and the people who crafted it. Cheese in daily life cheese was a staple in the medieval diet. For peasants, it provided essential nutrients and variety, especially during winter months when fresh produce was scarce. It was eaten with bread, melted into porridges, or used to flavor stews. For the nobility, cheese featured in elaborate feasts, often accompanied by fruits, nuts, and wines. It was both sustenance and indulgence, a symbol of refinement and hospitality. Preservation and trade cheese's longevity made it ideal for storage and trade. Hard cheeses could be transported over long distances, becoming valuable commodities in medieval markets. They were traded across regions, introducing new flavors and techniques to different parts of Europe. A living legacy, many medieval cheeses have survived the test of time. Today, they are celebrated for their rich histories and complex flavors. Artisanal cheesemakers continue to honor traditional methods, preserving the legacy of their medieval predecessors. So now, dear listener, as you rest in the quiet of the night, imagine the cool embrace of a stone cellar, the scent of aging cheese in the air, and the gentle hum of time working its magic. Sleep well and dream of curds and crowns. Last night we explored the delicate world of wafers, crispy, sacred, and sweet. Tonight, dear listener, we descend into the cool, damp depths of the medieval cheese cellar, where time slows and milk transforms into gold. Welcome to the realm of medieval cheese. In the Middle Ages, cheese was more than food. It was a testament to patience, skill, and the alchemy of preservation. From humble cottages to grand monasteries, cheesemaking was both a daily chore and a revered craft. The art of cheesemaking began with fresh milk, cow, goat, or sheep, gently warmed and combined with rennet, an enzyme that curdles the milk. The resulting curds were cut, drained, and pressed into molds, then salted and left to age. The aging process was crucial. In cool stone cellars, cheeses matured over weeks or months, developing flavors ranging from mild and creamy to sharp and pungent. The environment, temperature, humidity, and even the presence of certain molds played a significant role in shaping the cheese's character. Monastic monasteries were at the forefront of cheesemaking innovation. Monks, with their disciplined routines and access to resources, refined techniques and created cheeses that would endure for centuries. These monastic cheeses were often produced in large quantities, with meticulous records kept of recipes and aging times. The result was a variety of cheeses, each with distinct textures and flavors, reflecting the region's terroir and the monks' dedication. Varieties. Across regions, medieval Europe boasted a diverse array of cheeses. Brie, originating from France, this soft cheese was enjoyed by both peasants and royalty. Cheddar. Hailing from England, cheddar was known for its firm texture and sharp taste. Roquefort, a blue cheese from southern France, aged in limestone caves with a distinctive tang. Gouda. From the Netherlands, this semi-hard cheese was prized for its rich, buttery flavor. Each cheese told a story of the land, the animals, and the people who crafted it. Cheese in daily life. Cheese was a staple in the medieval diet. For peasants, it provided essential nutrients and variety, especially during winter months when fresh produce was scarce. It was eaten with bread, melted into porridges, or used to flavor stews. For the nobility, cheese featured in elaborate feasts, often accompanied by fruits, nuts, and wines. It was both sustenance and indulgence, a symbol of refinement and hospitality. Preservation and trade. Cheese's longevity made it ideal for storage and trade. Hard cheeses could be transported over long distances, becoming valuable commodities in medieval markets. They were traded across regions, introducing new flavors and techniques to different parts of Europe. A living legacy, many medieval cheeses have survived the test of time. Today, they are celebrated for their rich histories and complex flavors. Artisanal cheesemakers continue to honor traditional methods, preserving the legacy of their medieval predecessors. So now, dear listener, as you rest in the quiet of the night, imagine the cool embrace of a stone cellar, the scent of aging cheese in the air, and the gentle hum of time working its magic. Sleep well and dream of curds and crowns. Last night we explored the delicate world of wafers, crispy, sacred, and sweet. Tonight, dear listener, we descend into the cool, damp depths of the medieval cheese cellar, where time slows and milk transforms into gold. Welcome to the realm of medieval cheese. In the Middle Ages, cheese was more than food. It was a testament to patience, skill, and the alchemy of preservation. From humble cottages to grand monasteries, cheesemaking was both a daily chore and a revered craft. The art of cheesemaking began with fresh milk, cow, goat, or sheep, gently warmed and combined with rennet, an enzyme that curdles the milk. The resulting curds were cut, drained, and pressed into molds, then salted and left to age. The aging process was crucial. In cool stone cellars, cheeses matured over weeks or months, developing flavors ranging from mild and creamy to sharp and pungent. The environment, temperature, humidity, and even the presence of certain molds played a significant role in shaping the cheese's character. Monastic monasteries were at the forefront of cheesemaking innovation. Monks, with their disciplined routines and access to resources, refined techniques and created cheeses that would endure for centuries. These monastic cheeses were often produced in large quantities, with meticulous records kept of recipes and aging times. The result was a variety of cheeses, each with distinct textures and flavors, reflecting the region's terroir and the monk's dedication. Varieties. Across regions, medieval Europe boasted a diverse array of cheeses. Brie, originating from France, this soft cheese was enjoyed by both peasants and royalty. Cheddar. Hailing from England, cheddar was known for its firm texture and sharp taste. Roquefort, a blue cheese from southern France, aged in limestone caves with a distinctive tang. Gouda. From the Netherlands, this semi-hard cheese was prized for its rich, buttery flavor. Each cheese told a story of the land, the animals, and the people who crafted it. Cheese in daily life cheese was a staple in the medieval diet. For peasants, it provided essential nutrients and variety, especially during winter months when fresh produce was scarce. It was eaten with bread, melted into porridges, or used to flavor stews. For the nobility, cheese featured in elaborate feasts, often accompanied by fruits, nuts, and wines. It was both sustenance and indulgence, a symbol of refinement and hospitality. Preservation and trade cheese's longevity made it ideal for storage and trade. Hard cheeses could be transported over long distances, becoming valuable commodities in medieval markets. They were traded across regions, introducing new flavors and techniques to different parts of Europe. A living legacy, many medieval cheeses have survived the test of time. Today, they are celebrated for their rich histories and complex flavors. Artisanal cheesemakers continue to honor traditional methods, preserving the legacy of their medieval predecessors. So now, dear listener, as you rest in the quiet of the night, imagine the cool embrace of a stone cellar, the scent of aging cheese, in the air and the gentle hum of time working its magic. Sleep well and dream of curds and crowns.